Hey, everybody, I'm Scott Weichel. You're listening to MKOCRadio.com. I'm very happy to have this gentleman on the show with me tonight. He is a large part of rock and roll history, and it also ties into country because of some of the connections that he has. And if you remember the song Sugar Shack, was a monster number one in 1963, you'll certainly remember the name The Fireballs. And I have one of the original members of the group here with me today to talk about their fabulous career. This is George Tomsco. George, how are you tonight?
Scott, I'm doing fine, and how are you doing?
Fantastic. I want to thank you so much for taking time to be on the show. This is a true pleasure to be able to talk to you.
Oh, well, I like doing this kind of stuff, too, because if it wasn't for the music business, things might be totally different.
Amen to that.
I'm certainly happy to talk about it.
Well, I'm glad to have you. It's a very interesting career that you have, and I'm real anxious to talk about that. I'd like to go back to the beginning. Tell me a little bit of how the Fireballs came into existence.
Okay, well, let's see. The start would be, I had a friend that was a neighbor, and he was a young fella, a few years older than myself at the time. I was 16, and that was in 1956. I was born in 40. So he knew that I was interested in playing guitar, and at that time it was the thing that was the most popular was Western music out here in New Mexico, and there were a few local bands around, and I was really into, quote, the Western music, the early Western singers, Webb Pierce, Hank Williams Jr., not Jr., Hank Williams Sr., Hank Thompson, Lefty Frizzell, probably some of these guys, people are saying, gee, I've never heard of these.
Hey, that's all people. That's all people I play on my show on a regular basis.
Yeah, okay. But anyhow, he called me up. He was a neighbor over here, and he called me up. He lived in Texas and came up to visit his relatives quite often. And he said, "Hey," he said, "I'm coming up. I'm coming up to Raton. Actually, he's going to go see his Aunt Letty, who was the cook at the CS Ranch that was between Cimarron, New Mexico, and Springer, New Mexico, out there in the wilds. And it was a big ranch. And his grandmother was a cook out there. And he says, I want you to come down and see me down here." He says, I'll meet you there. It was on a Saturday afternoon. He said, "Why don't you come on down? I want to play some new music for you, and it's called rock and roll." And it kind of just locked up my brain. I said, "Rock and roll? What a stupid name!" I couldn't. I said, "I don't get it at all," and I really did. I says, whatever he's talking about, I know I'm not going to like it. And so anyhow, the day rolled around, and he got there, and he said, "Yeah," he says, when my aunt gets finished with the cook shack and they clear the tables and stuff," he said, "it'll be probably about 1 or 1:30 in the afternoon." And he said, why don't you try to time it so you can come down about 1:30 or 2. So I did. I hopped on my motorcycle at the time and went down there. It's about 65, 70 miles. And so I got in. He had this little record player on the long cook shack meal tables that they fed the cowboys on, and he put this big record on. Naturally, it was a 78. And he said, "This guy is called Bill Haley, and the song's called Rock Around the Clock. And so he put that on, and I couldn't believe my ears. Man, I thought, was that ever a neat stuff, you know? And he played that song, and then I said, well, why do they call it rock and roll? Why did they give it such a stupid name? And he said, I don't know, man, but he says, that's what this is. And he says, let me play you another one. And then he put on Elvis Presley's Mystery Train.
Oh, yeah.
And for the first time I heard Scotty Moore playing guitar, and I really went bonkers. And so we stayed there all afternoon. He only had 2 records, Bill Haley, Rock Around the Clock. I don't even know what was on the other side. See You Later, Alligator, or something. I don't know. And Elvis is all I can remember. We played Rock Around the Clock and Mystery Train over and over and over again for about 4 hours.
Wow.
Till it was time for the Cowboys to come back in the afternoon and get their supper meal, and then we had to kind of get out of the cook shack. Mm-hmm. So all the way home, I was thinking, man, where can I hear some of this music? Because our local radio station was all it would play was pop, big band music, and of course that was the days of AM radio, you know.
Right.
So I started searching the dial, and of course, in those days too, as in these days, the AM radio, you can get a lot of distance at night.
Yeah.
You can pick up a lot of other radio stations at night, and so I started, 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock. I'd kind of go out, like maybe go up one of the mountains here, and try to dial in some other radio stations, and I did find KOMA, Oklahoma City, and they were playing rock and roll music, Jerry Lee Lewis, Great Balls of Fire, and stuff like that. And I was really taken by it. And of course, I'd come home and get out a guitar and try to figure out what they were doing, and was just mesmerized by the whole wave of music. And then we had an opportunity. A friend of mine that used to be in school, he had moved to Las Vegas, and then he came back, Las Vegas, Nevada, and he came back, and he liked to sing, and he likes to sing Western music. So when he came back into town, I said, hey, let's get together and let's try to start a rock and roll band. And he said he had heard some rock and roll music too, so we got together and started rehearsing. He and I. His name was Chuck Tharp, and he was our original lead singer in the Fireballs. So we started, and we worked up quite a few songs, some Western songs, and then what we could hear on the radio, and try to halfway do rock and roll wise. Of course, one of them was our stellar song that put us on the local charts, which was Great Balls of Fire, and that's where we got our name. But the school finally had a PTA talent show, and by then Chuck and I had recruited a rhythm guitarist, Danny Trammell, and we had recruited the local drummer. There was only one drummer in town, so we recruited him, Eric Budd, and the last but not the least was Stan Lark, who was the bass player, played the stand-up acoustic bass, and he was already playing with another, quote, Western band, Perry Turner and the Drifters. They were like the big important Western band in Raton, New Mexico. And so we finally captured him and got him to play bass for us, and we learned one rock and roll song for this PTA talent contest, and of course that was Great Balls of Fire. and we were the only ones in town that was attempting to play rock and roll music. And so the night of the talent show came around. I mean, we rehearsed that song 100 times. Night of the talent show come around, and of course it was our time to get out there and do what we was going to do, and we did Great Balls of Fire, and of course brought the house down because it was like the new thing, you know.
Wow.
And we did it real well, and so gosh, we got standing ovation, applause, and they want us to play another song. We only knew the one. It was Great Balls of Fire again, you know. And, of course, same thing happened after that. They wanted us to play another song, so we wound up doing it about 3 times, and they says, okay, that's enough, you know. And we got to get to the next act, you know. So, anyhow, that was how we started, and we didn't have a name for the group. My uncle, he told my dad, he said, you know, he says, maybe the band ought to call themselves the Fireballs. And I thought that was really a keen name, so we did. We started using that. And that was our launch point right there, and that was in, let's see, 16, 17. That was in actually 1958 during my senior year.
Okay. Yeah.
And it took us from 56 to 58, January of 58, to actually, well, we had gotten the whole group together like by November, December of 57, and then we were ready for that one, our first show, the parent-teacher talent show, PTA show, in January of 58, and so that was our culmination of getting the group together and really getting our teeth into one rock and roll song, which was, thank you very much, Jerry Lee Lewis's song. So, okay, that's how we got started. Now, where do you want me to go from there?
Well, Norm Petty Studios in Clovis, New Mexico. Obviously a very famous studio. A lot of great recordings were done there. And, of course, you guys recorded there, too. How did you come into contact with Norm Petty?
Okay. We had absolutely no idea from January 58 that there was a recording studio. We just didn't know where you could find one other than we had heard about stuff like in Nashville, you know, because of Western music, so to speak. So my folks wanted me to go to college. My dad, he says, son, you know, when you graduate, you're either going to have to get a job or you need to go to college. They didn't have money to send me to college. My grandfather had left me $750 to go toward my college, and between the time that he had left it and when it was time, by the time I graduated as a senior, to go to college somewhere, well, Mom and Dad had to use that $750 to get a new stove and a new washing machine. So that was used up, and be real honest with you, I had stars in my eyes about music. I didn't want to go to school. I just had no interest. I said, man, when I finish high school, I'm right up to the bottom of my nostrils with school. But I did like school, and I did like math. I wasn't a brain, but I got decent grades, B and B plus. I wasn't a flat A student, and I wasn't a D student either. But I did like school, but I had to work at it real hard. And because I did have good grades, and I wasn't perfect, but in those days they were a little bit more lenient than they are right now, about 4.0, 4.0, and I had an opportunity to qualify to go to New Mexico Institute of Mining and Technology down in Socorro, New Mexico, and I could, because of my good grades, I could qualify for work a half a day and go to school half a day, and you would do that all year long, And so my folks says, listen, you better take advantage of that because we don't have the money to send you. You better get continuing education so you can do something with your life. And they knew that I liked music, but that in their mind, that was just that was an after-school thing or an after-work thing. That wasn't
kind of like a hobby.
Yeah, like a hobby. Yeah, it was nothing to pursue for real. And so I did. I wound up signing up and getting down there to New Mexico Institute of Mining and Technology in Socorro. And the first thing I did, of course, I started trying to find a local band down there that was playing some of the bars or the clubs or whatever, and see, because I needed to make some money. I was like, here I am at school and I'm totally broke. And I mean, I'm starting out broke, and I couldn't find anything. There just didn't seem like there was any active music available at the time, or else I just didn't run across it. But I had taken my little record player, and during the times here in Raton that we were rehearsing with the Fireballs, the music director from our high school, Mr. Pat Chavis, would come. He had bought a new disc cutting machine, and of course with it was those great big vinyl discs that they'd put a blank in this machine, and then they'd drop the cutting needle down on it. You'd plug a microphone into this box, into the machine, and he used to like to come to the Fireballs rehearsals because he was experimenting. Where do you put this microphone to get the best coverage so you can cut the best music with this little machine? And I had a couple of those recordings. I'd bought a couple from him, and I had those down there in Socorro. And one Saturday afternoon, it was like I hadn't been there 30 days, and I was playing one of those little discs because I had my small portable record player there, and I played 78 speed records, and so I had my dorm room open. It was a Saturday morning, and the door was open, and music was going, and everybody was kind of doing their own thing, either going to get their clothes washed or something, or I don't know what I was doing, but I had my music on. And so I noticed this guy standing at my door. He's just kind of leaning up against the doorpost and just listening. And when the song was over, he says, "What's that?" He said, "Who is that?" And I said, "Oh, that's our little band up in Raton, the Fireballs." And he says, "Gosh," he says, "you guys sound pretty good." He said, "You ought to go down to Clovis, New Mexico, and go record at Norman Petty's studio." He says, "I live in Clovis," and he said, "that guy's got this studio, and he records Buddy Holly and Buddy Knox and Roy Orbison, and gave me a bunch of names. The only two names that I had mentioned, that he mentioned that I knew anything about was Buddy Holly and Buddy Knox, because by then Buddy Knox had Party Doll, I think, and I knew of Buddy Holly's That'll Be the Day, and so I had learned that stuff by listening to KOMA, Oklahoma City, here in Raton. And so I says, wow, for sure, what's the guy's name? And I wrote all this stuff down. And I came home the next weekend, and I said, man, I want to call this guy. So I called down there. In those days, we of course, didn't have dial phones or anything, and you'd pick up the phone and say, information, please, and it'd say, what city, and you'd say Clovis, New Mexico, and what party are you wanting to speak to? Well, the Norman Petty recording studio. Okay, just a minute. And then they'd go off the line, and they'd do whatever they had to do to get the connection, and then pretty soon they'd come back on if they were ready with your call. And so then they'd hook you up, and you could hear that person on the other end, which just happened to be Norman's secretary. And she said, yeah. She says, my name is Norma Jean, and can I help you? I said, well, we have a little band up here in Raton, New Mexico, and I have a friend that told us about Norman Petty Studios in Clovis, and I said, what we want to do, we want to make a record. And by then I had written one song and was co-writer of another one with Chuck, a vocal that he and I wrote, and an instrumental that I had written myself, which was a strange little story that happened down there in the dorm. One night I got this tune in my mind. I couldn't get it out of my mind, and but I didn't know how to play it on guitar. I kept hearing it, and so I pulled my guitar out from under my bed, got it out, and I started trying to match what I was hearing so that it would sound like that on the guitar when I played it. And so it was that was the first song I had ever written, called Fireball. Here we go, using the Fireball thing again, and which I didn't have a name for it at the time, but we did record it, and Norman named it for us. So anyhow, getting back to the information about Norman, said we'd like to make a record. She said, well, just a minute, you'll have to talk to Mr. Petty about that. And of course, I was scared out of my shoes. And he got on the phone, was very nice, easygoing guy, and says, well, we're up here in Raton, and we have a little rock and roll band called the Fireballs, and we want to make a record. And he said, why don't you send me a tape recording of your band? And I said, well, we didn't have a tape recorder. That was just that was luxury stuff, and we didn't have a tape recorder, didn't have an access to it, and I didn't even think about sending them a 78 disc or anything. So I just told him, I fibbed to him. I said, well, we don't, we're going to be down there playing around Clovis in about a couple of weeks, and could we come by and audition for you live, And he said, in a couple of weeks? Yeah, I said, yeah. And he says, well, where are you going to be playing? I said, well, we don't have that actually together yet. And I was fibbing to him. We didn't have any plans on doing that. But then I asked him, I said, well, could we come by and audition for you sometime? Like if we're going to be playing weekends, could we come by on a Sunday and let you hear us real time? So he said, well, I guess so. He said, but he said it would have to be after. He said it'd have to be 2 o'clock, because he said it was at that time. He said 1 o'clock. He said it'll have to be around 1 o'clock because I go to church on Sunday, and he said I'm not finished until about 1 o'clock. And so we got the address of the studio and all that. I hung up the phone, boy, and I was excited. I called the rest of the guys and I says, hey, you know, in 2 weeks we can go down and audition for Mr. Petty on a Sunday at 1 o'clock. And of course, they were all excited too. I mean, just the talk of the possibility of us auditioning for Buddy Holly's guy, you know, and a recording studio in Clovis. You mean there's actually something down in our state like that? And it was all news. We were floating in the clouds. So I went back down, of course, Saturday or Sunday afternoon, went back down to Socorro, and Monday morning, get this, I started going around to all my professors and saying, I'm quitting school because I'm going into the music business.
Wow.
I mean, we hadn't even auditioned for the guy. I mean, it was so loose. There were so many loose ends. It was unbelievable. And here I was making an official announcement that I'm going into the music business.
Wow.
So that's what happened. I got myself out of school Monday and Tuesday. I had gone around to see all the professors and everything, and loaded up my car and headed back home. And boy, did I get a nice greeting when I got home.
Yeah, I'll bet.
Dad was very upset, and he said, "Well, son," he said, "I tell you what," he said, "if you're gonna live here," he said, here's what you're gonna do. You're gonna pay half of the utilities. You're gonna buy some groceries, and you're going to get a job, and you're going to have to just make your own way, and you can stay here and you can finally find you a place and get out on your own. And he was very upset about, because I did have a nice little deal with school, but let me tell you, that was a tough school for me. The math in it was just unbelievable. And I was glad to not have to do that, because I had been at that school for about 30 days, and so I just I said, well, okay, you know, I knew that I just told Dad, I said, well, in a couple of weeks we're going to go down and audition for Mr. Petty at the studio, so, you know, let us get that done. And we rehearsed up here at the house and, you know, tried to get as many songs ready as we could and stuff. And so we did go down. We got down there on in order to get enough gas money to get to Clovis, if you took the shortcuts all through the side roads and everything from Raton, New Mexico to Clovis, the shortest route possible, you had to go through Roy, New Mexico, which was probably the biggest town between Raton and Clovis. And in Roy, they had one bar, Rigoni's Bar. So I called them and I said, hey, who do you have playing down there on Saturday night? Because we need to make some gas money to get to Clovis. And I said, who do you have playing on Saturday night, such and such time? And he said, we don't have anybody. I said, well, how much do you pay bands to play? You know, we're the Fireballs. And he said, "Oh yeah, we've heard about you and heard some good stuff about you guys up there in Raton stuff." And he said, "We don't pay anything." He said, "We charge $1 a person at the door," and says, "You can keep all the door money, and we'll keep the money from selling the drinks."
Uh-huh.
So yeah, I said, "Okay, well, we'll take our chances at that." So we did, and the next 2 weeks, we put out posters everywhere we could about the Fireballs going to be at Rigoni's bar, such and such Saturday night, and all that stuff, and it worked pretty good. We had like a couple hundred people that came in through the door, and it was a very successful night. So we had about $200 to continue us on to go to Clovis, which was thank goodness we had that. So we went ahead and drove on down to Clovis after that Saturday night at Rigoni's, and got the cheapest motel we could there, which by the time we got there was about 4 o'clock in the morning, and we had audition for Norman at 1, and so as it worked out, we were like we couldn't sleep. I couldn't sleep, and so we was watching the clock, and finally it rolled around about 1 o'clock for us to be there, and we Norma Jean opened the door and let us in, and we started setting up in the music room, the musicians' room of the studio. There was a couple of guys working in the control room, and they were both young guys,
Uh-huh.
And I had Norman Petty pictured as a fella like with a big protruding stomach, with a white shirt and a tie, a white shirt bulging out at the buttons, and smoking a cigar, kind of a guy like, hey, we can make you a star, young man, that kind of thing, because that was the proverbial picture of a talent coordinator or anybody that was in the music business that wasn't a musician. There was a promoter or whatever. And so I was waiting for somebody like that to kind of come through the door. And we got set up and started rehearsing because we wanted to be ready when Mr. Petty came in to listen to us. So it was about 2 o'clock, and these guys were still in the control room, and Norma Jean was back and forth between the control room and the musicians' room. I said, gosh, it's, when's Mr. Petty going to be here? She says, oh, he'll be here. She said, he'll be here. Don't worry about that. And then she'd go back out, and we'd rehearse some more and everything. So then it was about 3 o'clock, and I started getting real uneasy about it. She came back in, and I said, well, where is Mr. Petty? And she says, well, he's in the control room.
He was already there.
So one of those kind of young guys was they were well groomed, and what it was it wound up being Norman Petty was one of them, and the other one was Robert Linville of the Roses, who was one of the backup singers for Buddy Holly.
Oh, wow.
And a group called the Roses. And he was helping Norman with some of the editing and stuff that they were doing with Buddy's recordings. And so anyhow, she went in there and told Norman that his cover had been blown. So he come walking in. He was kind of halfway smiling and laughing. And what he had been doing was, they were acting like they were busy in there, but he had a condenser microphone on in the studio room, and he was listening to us rehearse and talk and all that stuff. So he's kind of getting the jump on what kind of guys we were, what kind of music we were playing, and what we were thinking and all that stuff, you know. Because well, you know how a condenser microphone is.
Yeah.
I mean, you can hear somebody breathing a block away.
He was pretty smart.
Yeah. So he said, he said, I've been listening to you, and he said, let me ask you this. He said, have you guys got any original material? And I said, I don't know what you're asking. What is original material? And he said, well, have you written any songs? Oh yeah, we've written 2 of them. And he said, well, did you play them? Yeah, we played them. One of them was that guitar song, and of course we played several guitar songs, a polka and some other stuff that was, you know, popular during those days. And Chuck was singing some songs, and so he said, well, would you play them again? And I said, yeah. So we played My Guitar Instrumental, which was, and we didn't have a name for it at the time, and then a song that Chuck and I had written, and it was a vocal song. It's called I Don't Know. And so we played them both for Norm, and he said, well, who's your publisher? Who's your music publisher? And again, I said, I don't understand what you're talking about. What does that mean? He said, well, if you're going to record, he said, you know, you have to have a publisher of the songs you're recording. And so I said, well, we don't have that. We don't know anything about that. And so then he said, well, if you recorded, he said, would you care if I published your songs? I mean, and that blew my mind, because here's the guy that was managing, or he was the big wheel with Buddy Holly, and he's asking us if we were to record, could he publish our music? And I didn't really understand what he was asking, so I said this. I can remember. I said, well, whatever that means, the answer is yes. And so he kind of laughed at that too, you know. And so he says, well, your little band sounds real decent. He said, it really does. And he said, I said, well, can we go ahead and record? Could we do? I mean, here we are in the studio and everything. Can we record right now? And he said, no. He said, I don't record on Sunday. He said, I just.
After all this, huh?
Yeah. And I said, okay, well, can we record tomorrow? No. He said, I can't Monday and Tuesday because I'm recording Buddy Holly and the Crickets again. They're going to be over from Lubbock tomorrow and Tuesday. And he said, I won't even have any. I said, I'm full up until Wednesday. So I said, well, if we stayed in town, could we record Wednesday? Well, before I said that, he said, why don't you all go ahead and go on back to Raton and then give me a call. We'll figure out a time in the future when the Fireballs can record. And see, I didn't want to leave town. I didn't want to leave the studio.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I said, well, could we, if we stayed in town, could we record on Wednesday? He said, well, if you want to do that, I guess you can. And of course, all of this is happening on $200 that we had made, at Ragoni's bar, because none of us had any money. And get this, Stan Lark, the bass player, he was on his way down to Las Cruces, New Mexico, because that Monday, the next day, he was supposed to register at the college or the university there in Las Cruces.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah. So that's what he was supposed to be doing. Eric was supposed to be back in Raton. He's a draftsman for Alco Metal Products, a metal frame and door company, and the only one that didn't really have a heavy commitment was myself and Chuck Tharp, the lead singer. He never had a job. he was wanting to be a full musician the day he come out of the womb.
So he was on board with all this.
yeah, he was born into wanting to be a musician and a singer and being in the music business. So he didn't have a job, but he had been in the service and stuff. So, and then the other one was Danny Trammell, our rhythm guitar player, and he also was supposed to be in Raton at the Coca-Cola plant. He was helping bottle and Coca-Cola, and that's where he was supposed to be Monday. So anyhow, Norman had to leave the room, and I told the guys, I said, hey, man, this guy likes us. He said that we could, he'd like to, whatever it means to publish our music and whatever that is. And I said, don't leave. Let's stay right here until Wednesday. I mean, what would happen if between now and Wednesday he decided he didn't want to mess with us, didn't want to record us or whatever? I said, don't leave town. So I convinced everybody, and they would call back home, except Stan. He didn't call his folks and let them know that he wasn't going on down to Las Cruces to register a school. And Eric called his boss and said, could he be a couple of days late? Because, and this was the good news, we said, because we're going to make a record on Wednesday. And so that was a big deal. I mean, a little band from Raton, New Mexico is going to be making a record. Wow, So all the guys that were working had jobs, and they called their bosses. Said, yeah, okay, well, I guess, that'll be all right. So that's, as a matter of fact, that's what we did. We got us stayed in the cheapest motel we could and tried to eat hamburgers, and that's all. And but we were in those days dragging Maine, chasing the Clovis cuties, and so when Wednesday come around, well, Norman told us. He says, well, I charge $150 to make your first recording. And he said, he had told us this when we were, right after we finished auditioning on Sunday. He said, this is the way it works. He said, you have to pay for your first recording. He said, we don't go by the clock. He said, we try to just do it until we get a good cut. So that he says we don't charge by the hour, but we just charge by the session, which two songs would be $150. And he said, so we says, well, okay, we can do that. Well, of course, by the time Wednesday rolled around and we were going to go back to the studio, we didn't have the money.
Right.
Because we're having to pay for the motel and the gas in the cars and the burgers. I mean, we're like five guys trying to live on, we come down with $200 and then we're supposed to pay Norman $150 after the session. And that $50 did not last between Sunday and Wednesday evening. So we went to the recording studio Wednesday evening. I was just really, really put down. I said, man, we walked in. I said, guess what? We don't have the $150. And he said, oh, really? And I said, no. He said, how much do you have? I said, well, I think we got about $95 left. And he said, He said, well, he says, I'll tell you what we can do. He says, I've already got the time set aside. He said, we'll go ahead and record 2 sides. And he said, but you pay me the $75 right now, and then we'll go ahead and do the session. But I'm not going to try to show the recording or take it. I won't try to do anything with your recording until you send me the other $75.
Right.
And so says, well, okay, man, you mean we can go ahead and do both songs now anyhow? And he said, yeah, let's go ahead and do it. So he said, but I'll tell you what, he says, you go ahead and go grab a bite to eat, because he said, this is going to be your first session. It's not going to be as easy as you think. So go to the drive-in Foxy's down the street and get you a little bite to eat and come back, and we'll get started serious. And what we didn't know was Buddy Holly, after they had finished recording Monday and Tuesday, when they went back to Lubbock Tuesday evening, or actually Wednesday morning early, was the Wednesday day, Buddy had called back to Norman. They were having a few, at that time, misunderstandings or differences or whatever. Things weren't running real smooth between Norman and Buddy at that time. And I don't know exactly what it was, but just probably life. Life gets in the way. Things change, and things are different for everybody, and you have to work things out. So anyhow, he knew that Buddy was wanting to come over and talk with him Wednesday early evening, and so that's why Norman shuffled us off to Foxy's to go get a bite to eat before we started our session. We came back. We didn't know that, but when we came back, there was a pink Cadillac parked in front of the studio with Texas license plates. And that was not any of the cars that was there when Buddy Holly was there. And so, I mean, Norman didn't let us come by and see Holly, or he didn't let it. He says, no, he says it's a closed session Monday and Tuesday. And so we had to stay away. All we could do is drive by and see that there's cars there with Texas license plate.
Right.
And so anyhow, when we came back from Foxy's, there's this pink Cadillac, and I walked in the door, and I looked in the musician's room, the immediate right, through the double pane windows there, and I could see this really strange-looking guy with these big dark glasses on. I didn't know what Holly looked like, and he had my brand new guitar, and he was playing my brand new guitar and had his foot up on my brand new amplifier.
Oh my gosh!
And like I was 18 years old and very possessive of my new guitar and my new amp,
Sure.
I had sold my motorcycle to get that stuff. And so I marched into the control room, and Norman was there and said, hey, who's that guy in there with playing my guitar? I didn't give him permission to play my guitar. He's got his foot up on my brand new amplifier. And he kind of looked at me and looked through the windows and then looked back at me. He said, I said, that's Buddy Holly. Well, of course, I had an immediate attitude adjustment.
Yeah.
And so about that time, he punched the talk back button and in the studio there, and he said, hey, Buddy, he says, come in here and meet these guys. So Buddy put my guitar down, and come into the studio, kind of had his hands in his front pockets. He had a T-shirt on, and he was kind of shoulders hunched up, kind of up in the air a little bit, and he's smiling. Says, Norman says, "Well, everybody says shake hands with Buddy and introduce yourselves." So we all, each one of us did, and shook hands with him, and then we didn't know what to say. I mean, it was like, we were frozen in time with our mind.
Yeah, and you hadn't recorded yet either, right?
Shook hands with,
Yeah.
And, I mean, That'll Be the Day was a huge hit. And you hear, I mean, here's this guy that you're hearing all these songs with that was recorded at this studio and with Norman and all that. And it was like, pinch me, am I dreaming? And so he said, so, well, what are y'all going to do, make a record? Yeah, that's what we're going to do. Yeah, well, is this your first time? Yeah, it's our first time. Well, good. He's kind of laid back and smiling and kind of, just had a really, really nice personality. West Texas was kind of easygoing guy,
Yeah.
And so there was just a little bit of small talk going on, and I don't even remember what else was said. But he finally said, "Well, Norm," he said, "I guess I'm going to head on back to Lubbock." And he said, "Guys, good luck, and we'll talk to you later." Norm, I'll talk to you later. And so Norm says, "Okay, yeah, So Buddy left, and we got back in the studio and started going through our motions for our first take with the guitar instrumental thing, and we did finally get both songs done that night. And we had 2 cars down there with all our gear and everything. Had paid Norman $75. And we had $25 left, or $20 for 2 cars that were out of gas that we was going to have to come back home. $10 a car, enough gas to drive 235 miles each.
Wow.
And but we did make it. We did make it back home.
Wow. Now, what were the first 2 songs that you recorded, George?
Fireball. It was the guitar instrumental, Fireball, and I Don't Know. The only 2 songs that we had written at that time. And of course, when we finished with the session, immediately thereafter, Norman brought the paperwork out for the publishing, and at that time he was part-time publishing with another company, and he didn't really have his own publishing, but he was working with Melody Lane Music out of New York.
Mm-hmm.
So wound up, we signed the contracts on that, and being we were 18 years old, well, I could, and Chuck had just turned 18 too, so. We did that, and then we headed home. And the next weekend, we booked a little job in Springer, New Mexico, and we played a little dance down there on a Saturday night. And I could remember we made $80, and we owed Norman $75.
Uh-huh.
And so, of course, there's 5 guys in the band. So our pay that night was $1. So happy because I had that $75 in my pocket, and then as soon as Monday rolled around, I got a money order and sent Norman, put it in the mail, $75 money order. And it was just tickled pink that we had made a $1 a piece. So,
you got him paid. That's great. George, I've got to take just a little break here and do some station identification. We're going to come back and talk more with George Tomsco. This very in-depth interview about the Fireball. Stay with us, folks. MKOCRadio.com. Hey, everybody, I'm Scott Weichel. You're listening to MKOCRadio.com, and we are talking with George Tomsco about the beginnings of the Fireballs, and we're going to hear about Bulldog and Sugar Shack and how their band came into existence and getting signed with Dot Records, and the rest is history. George Tomsco, it's nice to have you on MKOCRadio.com. Thanks so much for being here today. Continue with your wonderful story.
Okay, Scott. Well, I tell you what, once I get going on this, of course, it's just like I relived the whole, 50 years ago thing, But anyhow, okay, where I picked up was we sent Norman the $75, and then when he got the money order through the mail, and then he called and he says, yes, I received it, and he said, I tell you, he says, I'm going to be going to New York, and he said, I will take your tape with me, and we will try to shop it and see if there's anybody interested in what your band is about. And so he called me from New York and said, yeah, he said, I think we have somebody interested, Kapp Records. Mr. Dave Kapp, K-A-P-P, has a nice little label, and he likes the guitar song. And by then, Norman had already named it Fireball. So he said, he said, Dave likes Fireball and would like to put this thing out maybe in January of '59. He said it's not a good time of the year right after, of course, New Year's and all that, because Christmas has just happened, and he said people aren't buying records. Everything is kind of slow, but we were itching to have a record released,
Yeah.
So, as it was, I think they released it. It was January, the end of January, actually. And as soon as that thing got out, we started getting Billboard magazine, which was the major magazine in the music industry. Did a pick on Fireball, and instead of the Fireballs, they called us the Fireballers. And misprint, but that was okay, I mean, we were glad to see our name in print, and
yeah, you knew who it was.
magazine, and then by golly, that little song did get enough airplay and attention and sold enough records to make it up to in the top 100 of Music Reporter, which was a Class B chart. It made it up to number 90 for 1 week, and then it was off the charts the next week. But we can officially say, and Norman could officially say on our behalf, yeah, this group they made the charts with their first record.
That's right, yeah.
That was a nice little piece of weak credibility. And so then he said, I need to have you guys come back down to the studio, and we need to cut another couple of sides or more if we can. And so by then, Chuck and I had written another really nice quality vocal, and I had written another song and which was called Torquay. And at the time, it wasn't called Torquay. It was called, I named it Curious, the original name of it. And so we went on down, I guess it was in February, March of '59, and went to the studio and did two more, just those two things, and got them ready for Kapp, because his deal with Kapp was the Kapp Records wanted first refusal of everything that we had recorded. So Norm said, okay. So Dave Kapp, the daddy, of the record company. He was off to England, and when Norman went back to New York, he went by to take our new recording of Torquay, because he thought they would be interested in the guitar side rather than the vocal. But of course, he took them both, and I guess Mickey Cap was playing record executive with Daddy's record company, and so when Norman went in to meet with Mickey, Mickey had his feet up on the desk and was playing big record guy, and so Norman played him The Curious at the time, and Mickey said, "Well, Norm, I don't know, that doesn't really necessarily excite me. I don't know that it's necessarily that good." And that they had words back and forth, and I guess Norman got pretty upset with him because Mr. Cap really liked the Fireballs, but he was gone, and so he wasn't hearing what our next submission was. So anyhow, Norman and Cap Records, through Mickey's Dave's son, they had such a disagreement, they wound up standing in front of each other, tearing up the Fireballs contract.
Oh my gosh!
And so Norman said, he said, I walked down the stairs from Cap Records, across the street, and up the stairs, I heard about a new record company from England that was in town in New York, and it was called Top Rank. And he said, I went up the stairs, got in front of the secretary and asked who was in charge of Top Rank, and it was a fellow by the name of Norman Weinstorer. And so he says, could I make an appointment to see him? And she says, well, as a matter of fact, probably so. Yeah, as a matter of fact, I think he's got some time now, because they were just getting started. So Norman went in and played Torquay for him, and at the time it was called Curious again. And Weinstorer said, "Man," he said, he says, I really like this group. He said, the only thing is, he says, I just returned from a resort in southern England, and it's called Torquay, but they spell it Torquay, but it's pronounced Torquay. And he said, this song reminds me of that resort. He said, if we were going to do business, I'd like to change the name of this and put this record out and call it Torquay. And so Norman called me from New York and said, hey, we're no longer with Cap Records. It was a new record company from England called Top Rank. Norman Weinstorer really likes the cut, but he wants to change the title. And so we had already signed the publishing papers with the title Curious. And he says, what do you think? And I says, well, Norman, what do you think? I don't know. And he said, well, they want to call it Torquay. I didn't really like that name. That was then, not now. But he said, he says, well, if they want to do that and put the thing out, we don't have a record label. Let's go with it. So I said, well, I guess, I don't know. You do what you think. I just don't know. Because all this music business is new to me at the time. I'm just a 19-year-old kid. Well, I wasn't even 19 yet. So anyhow, when he came back from New York, he says, we have a deal. He says, we're signed with Top Rank. And he said the record was going to be out such and such time. And sure enough, it came out. And then that Torquay, as we say it in the United States, made it in the top 100 up to number, I think it was number, the highest it got was 39. But it did very well.
That's pretty impressive for a new act, absolutely. Yeah.
So, and man, they put ads in Billboard on the Fireballs, and it was a happening thing for us. And then Norman said, right after that was released, he said, he called me and he said, why don't you guys come on down to Clovis? And he said, I'd like to have the Fireballs for my studio band, because he knew that not only could we write and play, but we were flexible enough. We could help other artists if they came in and wanted to do a song or something. We could learn it, and we could do it like they wanted to do it. Well, mainly, we'd do it according to the way Norman wanted us to do it. He was the one who was calling the shots on it. And so he said, why don't you come on down here and you can live in the back apartment and be my studio band. I couldn't believe that.
Wow.
You know? And this was in February of 1959. So away we went down. We had been on tour. Let's see. Yeah, we had been touring around a little bit, and Norman called us to do that. And of course, we did go down and started that whole scene up, and I had written Bulldog, and we recorded that, and then recorded one of on the other side of Bulldog was Nearly Sunrise, which was a song that Norman had written. And I didn't know it at the time, but he was already trying to figure out a prototype for the name String-Alongs. And so we had a totally different sound on the backside of Bulldog, and that's what he was trying to accomplish anyhow. But then when the record came out, disc jockey still played Bulldog, and January 1960, for Bulldog, we went and Norman had booked us on Dick Clark American Bandstand, the afternoon show in Philadelphia, and then 2 weeks later on Saturday night he had us booked in New York, Dick Clark's Saturday night Beach Nut show, and it was sponsored by Beach Nut chewing gum. Oh, yeah. And so we did American Bandstand afternoon show with Dick Clark, and then did the Saturday night show, and did a whole bunch of promotion stuff. We were with Top Rank Records. I mean, things really happened fast for us at that point, and it was good for quite a while, and until instrumentals started losing their appeal, you know. Yeah. And we were wanting to have a vocal, but it wasn't happening. We just couldn't get the disc jockeys were playing the instrumental side, but not the vocals. So Chuck, our lead singer, he got disenchanted with being in the band. He said, "Man," he says, I says, there's not any room for me as far as, because he actually didn't play guitar until Danny had left, and then he had to learn how to play guitar. But he was, wanting to be a singer and all that, so he says, "I'm going to quit." Well, this was in 1962. We had already been on American Bandstand and Dick Clark Saturday Night Show, but he didn't do any singing on those. He was just a guitar player playing instrumentals with what we were doing. So he made an announcement to us in '62, about summer of '62, and he said, "I'm going to quit. I'm just going to go up to Wyoming and go to ranching. I want to be a cowboy." I always wanted to be a cowboy anyhow. So he quit, and we were supposed to go to Canada on a tour. We had 30 days. We were supposed to be up in Canada on a tour. So we went to Norm and says, "What are we going to do?" Chuck quit. And so Norm says, "Well, I don't know." He says, I don't know. Maybe he says I can call over to Amarillo and talk to Jimmy and just see what's going on with him and stuff. So he did. He called Jimmy, and Jimmy came over on another Sunday. Well, see, these Sunday auditions, I tell you, seem like they were kind of the happening thing for our history. So he came over after church from Amarillo to Clovis. It was about a 100-mile drive, and we talked, and so we went in the studio, and he played some songs that he sang, and we just to see what the chemistry was going to be. We backed him up on those, and then we did some. Of course, he knew Torque and Bulldog and all that stuff, and he played guitar on those things with us as we were just trying to see, do we have a way that we can work together? And so finally he says, yeah, I think we got enough in common that we'll work together. And so said, would you want to step in and take the vocalist part of the Fireballs? And he says, well, he says, let me go back and talk to my folks and stuff, because I think he was in college or something at the time, and in Amarillo, junior college or something, I don't know. And so he went back that Sunday evening, and he actually came back Tuesday morning with his clothes and guitar and stuff, and just moved in, with us in the back apartment, and we started rehearsing, because in 28 days we were supposed to be up in Canada doing the tour.
Wow.
And we made it. So, and that was, then shortly after that, of course, in December of '62, we recorded, Jimmy and Norman auditioned these songs that were coming over from Plainview. Keith McCormick and Terrell McCormick were brothers. They had wrote a lot of songs, and they had one called Sugar Shack. And Norman and Jimmy liked it. We weren't in on the decision of that, but they liked it, and so we just threw it in the pot. As we were recording new things with Jimmy Gilmer, that was just another song, And so Sugar Shack came up for us to do session, and we did it. Of course, we didn't have that little solo vox thing in it at the time. It was just a real gutsy kind of a bottom end song, and we thought that we had a good cut on it. Didn't know that it was anything necessarily different at the time. And so one weekend when we were off playing some jobs, we came back to the studio, and we'd always, whenever we was gone and we come back into town, we'd let Norman know that we're back in town, and we're ready to record, or what do you have for us to do, or what's next, or what. We just kind of check in and find out what the schedule is going to be or whatever. And so it's about 11 o'clock at night on a Sunday night, and Norman says, hold on a minute. He says, let's go over to the studio. He lived in an apartment right next door to the studio. And so we went over to the studio, and Norman was always one that he was always trying to put an organ on our music, and we didn't like that. Organ just didn't fit in not the way he was doing it. He came from the pop side of 40s and 50s music, not like the cool rock and roll organ kind of thing.
Right, yeah.
And so we were always hesitant, hoping that he wouldn't want to put something, and he did. He wound up putting organ in on some stuff, and generally speaking, I didn't care for it. But we're working in his studio and living in his back apartment, and he's our manager and all that. You have to bend to a certain degree. And so as it wound up, he put this tape on, and it was Sugar Shack. We heard it go, da 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 da, And then, of course, Jimmy's voice come on, you know. There's a crazy little shack beyond the track. And then we heard this stupid little sound. And man, I mean, just immediately, in my mind, I saw a merry-go-round. That's exactly the picture I got in my mind when I heard that little solo vox doing that thing. And I says, oh, no. In my mind, immediately I says, uh-oh, man, he has ruined our session. He put that stupid little sound in it. It's just like I was thinking about the stupid name for rock and roll way back earlier, you know. And I said, oh, what a stupid little sound. I mean, I could just see this merry-go-round going around. I said, nobody's going to like that. And so after it was finished, then he says, well, what do you think, guys? And, you know, we kind of like looked at each other, and who's going to say what first? I says, well, I says, man, I don't know. That is just, that's awfully different. It's, you know, it's a left fielder for me. And so we left the studio, and all of us were griping about it. Every one of us. None of us liked it. And but Norman was all excited about. He thought that was. He said, you know what? We've taken a good song and we've put a signature to it. And of course I didn't quite understand what he meant and all that stuff at the time. But as it worked out, then we had a deal with Dot Records at the time, and Randy Wood with Dot Records and Norman, this is all what Norman told me, said that they had a deal to agree on each release for the Fireballs. And so when he took Sugar Shack to Randy says, no, Norm, I don't like that. He said, it's too different. And I forget what song we had. Well, as a matter of fact, I don't think that we had recorded a vocal yet with Jimmy. That might have been right on the front end of one or two that we had just done. And Norman was really excited about it, you know, but Randy, the record company guy, didn't like it. He said, man, it's too different. He says, that's just too, it's out in the cosmos, that people won't want that, you know. And Norm says, well, he said, Randy, I'll tell you what, he said, if you will go along with me and we'll put this one out, he says, if it doesn't make it, then I'll stay out of the decision and you can pick the next one. And so Randy says, well, he says, I'll tell you what I'll do. So I don't breach contract with you. I will at least officially release the record. But here's what I want to do. I'm going to press up 4,500 promotion records for the distributors. And he says, but I am not pressing up commercial sale 45s. He said, we're going to be wasting vinyl. So Norman couldn't convince him, so that's exactly what happened. Randy printed up 4,500 records, sent it to the distributors, and of course at that time the distributors were the ones that took them by the radio stations. And so the distributors took, you know, this new cut by Jimmy Gilmer and the Fireballs. And that was another thing that Norman did. He had made arrangements to retitle the group instead of the Fireballs featuring Jimmy Gilmer. It was Jimmy Gilmer and the Fireballs. I was upset about that. And so just because of the fact that he could have let us know ahead of time what he wanted to do, but he didn't. So anyhow, here comes the record out, 4,500 disc jockey copies, and I mean distributor copies. Distributors took them by the disc jockeys, and the disc jockeys started playing it and started to getting some reaction to it. But there was no commercial copies for sale.
Wow.
You know, it got to be number one in request in Amarillo. Of course, Jimmy was from Amarillo.
But nobody could buy it.
But nobody could buy it anywhere. You know, they were playing it in Denver. They were playing it in Dallas. Jimmy's father had worked for Phillips Oil Petroleum Company, and of course, go ahead. Did you ask a question?
No, go ahead. You're fine.
Okay, so you know, he was real proud of the fact that it was Jimmy Gilmer and the Fireballs. You know, and on his way, his promotion thing that he was doing from Amarillo down to Dallas, that was his job. He's a promo man for Phillips. And he would drive through all these little towns and look for a radio station tower. And whenever he'd see a radio station tower, he'd go find out where the radio station was and take a copy of this new record of his son. This is my son, Jimmy Gilmer, you know, Sugar Shack. And of course, they were glad to get new product because little towns, little radio stations, little towns, they didn't, you know, get much attention.
Right.
So we started getting all kinds of airplay, and they were calling Norman and saying, "Hey, well, where can we get? When are we going to have? When are commercial records going to be available?" You know, and Norman said, "The only thing he could do is call Dot Records out in California." He says, "I have no idea." So finally, Tom Thacker, who was a disc jockey in Amarillo, Texas, can't even think of the radio station, but anyhow, the call letters. But it was number one in request. He said people was coming by. They had a request window. That was in the days of the drive-up, you know, the drive-ins where you go get a Coke and you drive up to the radio station, and I'd open the door or open the window, and you could request a song, drive through radio requests. And so he said, "Man, it's number one. Everybody that stops in is, you know, 5 to 1 are asking for Sugar Shack." And so he finally started calling. Tom started calling Dot Records, and like every day, he'd call and say, when are we going to see, you know, some commercial copies? And finally, I guess Randy started getting enough of this flack from all over the country, and so he finally sent a telegram to Norman and said, "Norman, we're printing up 50,000 copies. I think it was for the Dallas area." And this is like it was released in April, May, June, July, August, September. Yeah, it was 6 months from the time it was released, the disc jockey, the distributor copies, until he started making commercial copies, and then we started getting telegrams every other day. Norm, pressed up 75,000 for the Detroit area. A couple of days later, Norm, looks real good. Sugar Shack looks good in New York, sending 100,000 copies.
Wow.
I mean, it just started, you know, pretty soon in 2 or 3 weeks. It was a 50, 75,000, 100,000, and pretty soon, well, it was up to, you know, like a million records. And
wow.
It's happened, you know, we like to say it overnight, but it had been building and building and building, and finally the lid came off, and yeah, Sugar Shack wound up being the number one song of 1963. 1.5 million records was that was
and that outsold every single record. That outsold every single recording in any genre for that year, and that's something I don't think it's ever been done since. That's pretty amazing.
Yeah. The one that was closest to it, and very close, was "Hey Paul" by Paul and Paula.
Mm-hmm.
That was the runner-up to Sugar Shack, but we did get the official notification from RIAA, Record Industry Association of America, that it was certified as Sugar Shack as being the #1 record of 1963. Yeah.
Wow.
And so then another ironic thing happened. Of course, that's 63. Then in January, the nice part about that was seeing that royalty check, the first royalty check in January of 1964 was when they sent that, because the record broke in September of 63. September, October, November, December. They finished up their books, and then they sent us the first big royalty check for Sugar Shack. I remember getting it. Was made out to Norman Petty Agency, and the first check was for $100,000. In 1963, that was a big check.
That was big money. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. You know, and man, that was that was real nice. And of course, then some more followed from then. After that, and I don't remember the figure. I just remember seeing that first one.
That's pretty cool.
Norm Petty Agency.
So of course, Norm took his cut out of that, of course.
Because we had an agreement, on royalties and stuff. Because Norman never did charge us for recording. He never did keep track of recording time. He didn't keep track of the hours. He didn't keep track of nothing. He just says, let's try to get the best thing we can get, and never charged us. That was just the way he did it, But he would share in case anybody did have a hit, and that I guess he did that with Holly and them too. That he would share in the royalties.
Right. Now
that was a good way to do it.
Now, obviously, you guys went out and did a lot of touring and everything. Who are some of the acts that you worked with at that time?
Now, say again, what would you ask?
Who are some of the acts? You obviously went out and did some touring after this song hit. Who are some of the acts that you toured with?
Oh yeah. Well, by then, see that was kind of the hippie time. Gosh, let's see. Some of the names that we, that's awful. I can't even think of some of those right now. Well, actually, when we first started, we did some touring dates with Buddy Holly. Okay, with the Crickets, Jerry Allison, and the guys. Our first tour back east was with trying to think of some of the Everly Brothers. We did some dates with the Everly Brothers, and in the 60s, in the 60s we did a lot of dates, and because we were a band, we were usually the sole artist on the gig. Very, very seldom did we did some things with other artists on television and stuff like that, but out on tour, a lot of the times we were the only band, we were the only act on the show that night.
Right. Now, you mentioned earlier that Norm had hired you guys to be kind of the house band there for his recording studio. And after Buddy Holly passed away, you guys, there were some recordings that Buddy Holly had done like demos of, and you guys went in and put the music to those, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, as a matter of fact, I had another friend that was asking me about that a few days ago, and I dug out the complete Buddy Holly box set that let's see, John Beecher and Malcolm Jones put together in England, and they had all the information on, because once Holly passed away, Norman, Mr. and Mrs. Holly, gave Norman the green light on going back and completing some recordings, like Buddy's apartment tapes and stuff like that. And yeah, that was we wound up dubbing in on 33 masters.
Wow.
Over a period of from 62 to 68. And there was a couple of years there that we didn't do anything on any of his stuff, but I had, as a matter of fact, compiled a list, and I'm glad that I have it now, because I didn't remember. You know, we did so much recording on our stuff, on other artists, and then doing stuff on Holly, 62, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. 11 sessions in 1962 of Holly's. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5 in 1963. 64, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 sessions in 64. Then didn't have anything in 65. I don't have it listed. 1966, only 2. Don't have anything listed for 67. 68 was 1, 2, 3, 4, 6. So all total, it was 33. We did dub-ins on 33 of Holly's things.
That's pretty cool. So after this point, after all the the big hit came and everything, how long did you guys stay together? And of course, I know you guys are very big overseas, and I know my overseas listeners are going to be real thrilled to hear this interview. And then what's going on with you guys today?
Well, actually, right now, the original Fireballs aren't together, and of course, throughout the years, like starting with the first one to leave the group, the original band was Danny Trammell, our rhythm guitarist. He got real sick with asthma, and besides that, his dad was a preacher and didn't want him playing rock and roll, so Danny quit early. But he did play. He was a great rhythm guitarist, and on our early instrumentals, that great instrumental rhythm guitar is Danny Trammell. And then Chuck quit. So through the years, we've switched off. Actually, Jimmy, after Bottle of Wine, he had left, went out to California, then went to Nashville. He wanted to get into the management side of the music business rather than the performing. And so the last original that was working together here was myself and the bass player Stan Lark. But since it's been 4 years now that Stan has not, he and I haven't played together. But crazy enough as it sounds, those little guitar instrumentals that we started out with, I've been to Spain 3 times, invited to go over there, and a group called the Vibrants out of Zaragoza, Spain. They're my backup band over there, and I've been over there on 3 tours with them, and been to England to the Pipeline Convention, with a group out of California, Mike Vernon, and ironic, his band is called Three Balls of Fire. and what's weird about that, he didn't choose that as trying to be part of the Fireballs thing. Three Balls of Fire was a name for a jazz group in New York in the early 40s or something.
I'll be darned.
No, and he picked up on that and was using that. Of course, he plays surf guitar, and he's got a surf band. And our early guitar instrumentals were influential to the California surf thing that happened out there. And so we, as a matter of fact, when we first played on the Dick Clark American Bandstand, and we didn't know what he meant, he introduced us as, okay, ladies and gentlemen, put your hands together for the Fireballs, the surf band from New Mexico.
I love it.
And it stunned my brain, you know. It says like, wow, what did he just say? I didn't know what he meant. As a matter of fact, I thought that he had gotten us mixed up with another band or something, you know. And our guitar instrumentals were influential to a certain degree on the California surf movement that was started.
Oh, sure, and still is. I know there was a group called Southern Culture on the Skids that tips their hat to you and your guitar playing, and you know, it certainly is still very influential in music today. I found a website called fireballs-original.com. Do you also have your own website, George, or is that pretty much the one to go to?
Yeah. Fireballs-original.com. Yeah, that's our website. We really don't keep up with it much. I mean, to a certain degree. Now, one thing that has happened that's very nice is the fact that Sean Nagy out in California, he has revived the Norman Petty original record label called Norva Jack, NOR-VA-JAK. Norman Petty had, of course, before it all started with Holly and all of that, he had a trio, and that was his own personal entry into the big music business. Was the trio had recorded and had a hit with trying to think of, I'll think of it here in a little bit, but they had a big record way before he started messing with Buddy Holly or Buddy Knox, and or the Fireballs. His recording studio actually was he had actually built it for his own trio, and then it went from there. I
gotcha. Sure, absolutely. Now, there's some music available for the Fireballs. I've seen some stuff on Amazon, and there's been some things reissued over the years, and I'm sure you had a hand in that as well.
Yeah, we've had we had a huge reissue campaign was done by Ace Records out of London. Mr. Trevor Churchill was the one that initiated all of that, and I think it's either 12 or 13 CDs that they reissued our whole catalog, recorded catalog from. Another label, Verez Saraband, they issued about 3 or 4. They put out some vinyl reissue albums on us.
Yeah, and there was Sundazed Records too, had some stuff out.
Sundazed Records, yes, Sundays, and now the big one that's been the most recent that's put out the box set, of course, is Sean Nagy out in California reissuing all of the whole Fireballs catalog on four CDs, and it's on Norvajack, which was Norman's original record label. So,
well, that's great. That's great. Well, George, it's been a pleasure talking to you today, and I know my listeners are really going to love this. This is great history to have down, and I want to thank you so much for taking time. And I want to thank Barry Keene. He's the one that got us in touch with each other. He's just a great guy in his own right. We've had some great conversations, and I want to thank him for getting me in touch with you, and I sure enjoyed talking with you today, George.
Well, thank you, Scott. Appreciate it, and I want to thank everybody out there that have been Fireballs or Jimmy Gilmer and the Fireballs fans. And you know, without selling records, well, we wouldn't have any. We wouldn't have a career in the music business. So, thank you all very much for that.
All right, and what a career it was. We're going to play some music from the Fireballs for you right now. And again, George Tomsco, thank you for being on MKOCRadio.com.
Thank you, Scott.